Hello.
Aloha nui loa, fumeana.
Wonderful to see you all.
Hello. Take the time to see everybody if you want. It's important to connect if you can.
Hello, friends.
Oh, so amazing.
Mm.
We hope you're all well, safe, healthy. You might check in with your body posture right now. And if you feel disconnected from your body in any way, sometimes it's helpful to touch your heart center with your fingertips and just kind of receive the touch there with your awareness connected there. And even if you feel disconnected or numb, to just feel the light pressure there from your fingertips touching. So it just kind of sets the stage for our awareness connected, but not trying to control in any way, but just receiving the sensations there just as they're happening of touching, lightly touching. And just seeing if you can receive those sensations. And notice if you can experience any tenderness or kindness, care. Or not, it might just feel like a quiet connection. And from there, you might let this particular kind of quality of awareness, the kind or quiet connection, just come into your abdomen or belly. And it's the same kind of process where you just let your hand touch there or not. But there's no forcing anything, just the attention, quietly connecting with whatever's happening there, moment by moment. And if your hand is there, you just let the movement, the swells of the breath come and go. And it's this beautiful understanding that we don't have to do anything with what's appearing, but let it be just as it is. There's no right breath or wrong breath. And if your hand is still there or not, you get that sense that we can actually receive the connection there. Receive the moment to moment shifting and movement, pressures or temperature. And if we notice the falling movement disappear, you see if you can be with that very refined way that the sensations disappear. Mindfulness is understanding the breath's nature. If it appears, it will live itself out and disappear. So we see if we can get out of the way and just let that birth, life, and death of this movement happen. Just as it is. And at times, just notice, is it a quiet connection? Can there be some care or kindness for this impermanence, this life, coming and going? Or not, just checking. Noticing the life of our body, the aliveness of our body in the same way. Just letting the attention go where it's naturally called. Or with sound, just receiving just what's appearing without embellishment. No need to add or subtract. No need to get something or get rid of anything. It's understanding its nature, life and death revealing itself moment by moment. With mind states, thoughts, emotion, a similar process of getting out of the way. Seeing if we can have that quiet connection without the extra embellishments, thoughts about checking if there can be sometimes some kindness or care. So there's that connecting without trying to get rid of or get anything, without controlling. As best we can. Whether there's aversion, attachment, joy, compassion, anxiety, loneliness, or sadness, loving kindness or peace. Letting life reveal itself moment by moment, life and death. It's not me, not I, not mine. Just like these exquisite clouds that you can see forming out of nothing, coming together and falling apart and disappearing. With a quiet connection, care, or kindness.
Thank you, Michelle. Mm. I wanted to share a story I've read in a few different newspapers in the last week or two. Others may have heard about this as well, of course. About a man in the kind of pretty deep in the jungles of Brazil, an indigenous man who passed away in the last couple of weeks, who was the last member of his tribe. And he's someone that, different groups had known about, for a number of years as kind of being on his own, um, living in his, traditional ways and surviving on his own for quite a few years. Most of the kind of, if I'm getting this story right, most of the few final members of his tribe were murdered, I think almost maybe 30 years ago by ranchers in the area who are always looking for more forest to take down to have room for more of their cattle. And then at various points, people had been killed since then. And at some point during that process, when this man at some point really became the last of his people, he just totally cut off contact and communication with anyone. Even other indigenous communities in his area knew about him but didn't have contact with him. He never had verbal contact with any of these folks who are there trying to study or communicate. He avoided any contact at all. If he noticed anyone in the area, he would go deeper as much as he could away to avoid any interaction. He didn't accept any gifts. He didn't accept any offerings. And at some point, some of these groups actually kind of protected a very large swath of land around him to sort of secure his ability to maintain himself and to continue his livelihood. But they didn't know his name. They didn't know anything about the language he spoke, and very little about the culture of his people. And so they found his body some weeks ago in a state of some kind of ceremonial state, and he had put feathers around him, clearly knowing that he was going to die. And so there's the atrocity of it is so evident, and the tragedy of it is so clear, to so many. This sense that this part of our human family has been cut off and destroyed by another part of our human family, the mainstream part of our family, and the tragedy of how much atrocity and lack of understanding, that goes on there. And you see some of these articles, they really talk about that sense of how nothing, the loss of whatever knowledge and views and ways of thinking and language and perspective, I think there's something about it has been so powerful to so many people in the unnameability of it, because there's so this way that maybe the West is used to knowing is totally unattainable in terms of name, in terms of identification, in terms of language, in terms of the sort of mechanisms of knowing that are in place in terms of the society that was encroaching upon him and the parts of it that were trying to protect him, and of course many others that are under existential threat right now. And of course, it speaks to all of our sense of just how much is being lost and how, socially, environmentally, on so many levels in our world and our planet. And I think that sense of our feeling powerless on many levels to do anything about it, or at least not clear in terms of the answers or the solutions that are available to us in a time frame that's makes things salvageable. And so I think what I want to focus on today is actually not so much the horror of it and the tragedy of it, but without denying that, but to really hold up, especially for us as yogis, the incredible potency and power and integrity of his silence over these past years, and to consider the ways in which there's something incredibly heroic about that, and beautiful and pure. As much as the world may feel a sense of loss about what they don't know about this person and his people, that sense that he felt the existential threat of any contact, right? Of really understanding something about the nature of the world we live in, of capitalism, of samsara, of colonialism, of whiteness, of whatever the sort of paradigm and matrices you might look at, that there was such an acute appreciation for the toxicity of it, that he was able to honor the beauty of his and the purity of his heart and his knowledge and of himself and of his people and of his ways, all the way through to the end. And that there's something about our practice and our tradition that very much honors that in very explicit terms, that I think is really important. And it's one of the most pure and beautiful examples of it I think I've seen in a long time, particularly maybe outside of our tradition of monastics, of people who we value their seclusion, and it shows up in the world in ways that are sort of easily recognizable parts of this lineage and this tradition. There's also this valuing in our tradition, and I think in Tibetan lineages, and I assume in Zen too, of the notion of Pacceka Buddhas, these beings who become self-realized, self-awakened, but who are silent, who don't teach, who don't share their knowledge with others, with the world around them. And that it's very revered and it's very recognized that this is a valid and legitimate way. Even the Buddha, as we know him, right, the story of the Buddha where, he became enlightened, awakened, and was very reluctant to teach at first. He just thought, boy, no one's just going to understand this. I might as well just stay quiet, and these devas came down supposedly and, convinced him of the worthiness of some people, right, to see it. And he looked around the world and he said, yeah, okay, there are some people that really just have a little dust mote in their eye and, are capable of realizing this, and that out of compassion, he'll offer that teachings. But this recognition also that that there are those, and there is a place for those who are quietly realized, who don't, um, and for whatever reason, don't share. And I think of the possibility of this, person in all of his years of being alone in the jungle, and of course, so much of his sort of sense restraint and seclusion beginning from a place of trauma in response to these violations and threats externally, but to not know the ways in which that might have developed and what beautiful qualities might have been cultivated and realized in this person's heart, and how beautiful a thing it is to protect them. Right? That we all, at some point, must understand that there is knowledge, a lot of knowledge out there that's never been written down. And maybe the most important sacred knowledge that's never even been diminished by language at all. Right? And that this is knowledge that we have access to. This is knowledge that we can value. We may find ways of putting language around it, around sharing it, but the value of the restraint and the seclusion and the silence and the containment and the honoring of the internal and the beautiful of ourselves, because we see that, and we are sensitive to the existential threat of contact, and the ways that any contact in terms of the six sense doors, but also in terms of society, in terms of engagement with the world, in terms with community and family and samsara, right? That contact with it without the protections, without the safeguards of these forces of mind, and without some ferocity with them, that they are subject to defilement, right, and to denigration of all that's beautiful and the potential beauty in our hearts and minds and our practice. And that this is not just a cynical look at the world or a cynical look at reality or samsara, but to truly reckon the razor's edge that we walk in terms of our practice, in terms of our trying to defend our goodness. And I don't think that that's like maybe news to most of us, especially the last few years from the pandemic and beyond that. I mean, with all of anyone we've come into contact with in this community, this sense of concern that our goodness is under attack, right? That it's that reading what we read and knowing what we know and the encounters we have, directly or indirectly with the world around us, can feel like they chip away at our sense of goodness, of our connection to our sense of goodness, our ability to feel compassion, to feel loving kindness, the sense of the growing momentum of anger, of fear, of ill will, towards our enemies or those we feel like might be the perpetrators of harm in our lives or the world. So this sense of the threat that our hearts face is, I think, something that we all have viscerally experienced and continue to. And so it's very important to take heart where we can, and to take guidance where we can, and inspiration where we can, even if it doesn't fit into so much of what the society values. Right? A society and culture right now that values sharing everything in terms of our narrative, in terms of our daily lives and social media, that values everything about connection and community. And of course, those things have like so much potential beauty. But there's like, where is the value of seclusion? Where is the value of sense restraint, right? Of protecting and protection of our sacredness, and of that which we know we need to protect and care for in order to cultivate and strengthen. in our tradition in particular, this aspect of sense restraint and of restraint in various ways, samvara, is so deeply honored. And I do think there's something that we don't maybe we're careful with in terms of leading with it in terms of our teachings. Um, Not so much, in terms of when we sit in Burma or with our monastic teachers. There's no sense that there's anything like uh, controversial about talking about sense restraint. But I do think, kind of culturally in the West, there is this sense of like not wanting to people feel shame or guilt or remorse for pleasure, and that we have a complicated relationship. I mean, every culture does, and throughout periods of time. But there's a sense of like not wanting to simply repress the mind and the heart and the impulses of it, where we see how many centuries of that sort of behavior and shame and guilt around sense experience and the enjoyment of it, or suppressing our ability to express our emotions. All these have sort of negative impacts, right, from perhaps other religious heritage that has a lot of cultural force, in our world. Um, but nevertheless, this sense of the power of restraint and the beauty and the necessity and what a powerful tool it can be in terms of protection, in terms of giving us the strength and capacity to cultivate the good in order to protect that which is holy inside of us, and to be able to deepen our abilities is so important. There's sometimes it's broken down into kind of like 5 different main categories. So sila samvara, sati samvara, jnana samvara, kanti samvara, and virya samvara. So that would be like a restraint in terms of ethics, restraint in terms of mindfulness, restraint in terms of wisdom, restraint in terms of patience or forbearance, and the restraint in terms of energy. That comes from energy. So, I don't need to go into a long explanation of these. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory. Moral restraint, right? The restraint from causing harm, from engaging in actions that are harmful to ourselves or others. Succumbing to forces in us that are immoral and unethical and cause harm that way. So there's this sense of, through the practice of sila and morality, that we are practicing a kind of restraint based on that matrix, on that principle of ethical conduct, and the restraint from harming, the restraint from our impulses around greed, hatred, and delusion taking shape and building momentum outside of the heart in the world around us. But also, of course, in our own speech, in our own minds, the ways that these things can take shape. Mindfulness, right? The restraint in terms of mindfulness is really this understanding of the sense doors. And I will say a little more about this later. I'll go into kind of a little more detailed explanation. But understanding mindfulness as kind of the guard by which sensory experience is allowed in, right? So it's the kind of we have a lot of ways of describing mindfulness. The soft readiness and the qualities of it that have to do with investigation and interest and exploration and awareness. There is also this sense of it as being guarded, right? As being a protection. The way in which it's through mindfulness that the potential toxicity of the sense experiences becomes cleansed, becomes manageable for the heart and mind to process, right? That it's de-thorned through this process because we're seeing it clearly, because we're observing it in the sense of its really its deepest protection. this quote from the commentaries that, greed and sorrow and evil unskilled states would overwhelm them if they dwelt, leaving the eye faculty unguarded, the ear faculty unguarded, the nose faculty unguarded, the body faculty unguarded, the mind faculty unguarded, right? That it is this protection from these unwholesome states, this particular kind of restraint in terms of the senses. There is jnana samvara, which is the wisdom restraint, which is the restraint that comes through insight. That when we have insight into the nature of phenomena as impermanent, as undependable, that there is a restraint that comes from that naturally. All right, a restraint from the continuing current of samsara, the continuing engagement of enchantment with objects. So it's a very particular flavor of restraint due to wisdom. There's the restraint as an aspect of khanti. Often we talked about it as patience, but also it's this forbearance, right? It's the restraint that's like the willingness to go through unpleasant experience, heat, cold, insult, injury, this restraint in the mind in terms of that, in terms of not acting out of aversion to it or not acting out of craving and greed to it. So again, it's not so much a moral quality, but as an awareness aspect of restraint in terms of forbearance, this willingness to undergo something difficult, something painful, something hard, rather than unleash our response externally or internally and have others be beholden to harmful outcomes. And then virya samvara, so the restraint that comes through action, through energy, and through enthusiasm to do good, to engage in wholesome actions, to help others. It says here, a practitioner awakens zeal for the non-arising of unarisen evil, of unwholesome states, and makes effort, arouses energy, exerts their mind, and strives towards wholesome, right? To ensure the wholesome arising of states. And when wholesome states have arisen, to ensure their maintenance and their prolonged existence. So this sense of the restraint that comes through activity, wholesome, beautiful, wonderful activity. How important it is to really understand, restraint not just as this sort of negation. And I think that's part of what's so hard about it sometimes to understand, and why it's so unfathomable sometimes to us, and why we're maybe off-put by the conversation around restraint. But also this sense of like, do we recognize it as something beautiful, as protective, that really has all these different dimensions to it, and again, this sense of being very careful to interpret this man's restraint, right, and his silence and his seclusion in Brazil, in just these sort of negative terms, like, that it was just in terms of trauma, or just in terms of, hatred for the world. It's like what that betrays in terms of our deeper understanding of the beauty and the power of sense restraint, and how hard it is, and how much energy it actually takes to protect ourselves, to protect our goodness, how complicated it is to be working on all of these lines at once. It's very important to recognize, and I was reading in this Mahasi book that I have, to really understand that, like, the restraint in terms of mindfulness, restraint in terms of forbearance, and restraint in terms of energy, when we fail in those things, that they're not moral failings, right? So restraint in terms of mindfulness, right? When we just don't have the ability to be mindful of what's happening, and so something gets in, and we're it's evocative, right? And it churns and it gets sort of rampant and out of our control, right? We've kind of lost that sense of guardedness. To really understand that that is not a moral failing, that it's a technical failing. It's simply a failing in terms of concentration and mindfulness, right? That's like very explicit is very powerful. And the same with forbearance, right? The sense of like, oh, you try to be with something difficult or you try to be with something really pleasant and you just, you can't help yourself, right? And you kind of like, yeah, go for it, right? Or the sense of the restraint in our hearts and minds kind of crumbles. To really get that that is not in and of itself an ethical breach, right? Or the same with virya, right? When we don't have the energy to be, putting forward in terms of like cultivating and protecting the goodness, right? In that aspect of restraint, I think it could take a long time for that to really sink in, because we are so, and this is part of why we're so careful about talking about it. It's like we're so fine-tuned to think of any sense of lack of restraint or lack of guardedness in the ways that the language is used as a moral failing, and therefore as a personal moral failing, that I am weak or I am not good enough or I'm a bad person or I'm a greedy person or whatever it is, right? The tendency then to identify with that. But to really understand it as no, it's really just a failure of skillfulness. And a very understandable one because it's so hard, because we're so inundated with sensory experience all the time, right? Out of our control. It's like at every sense door, this constant bombardment, that we have to be very careful about the expectation we hold for ourselves. But that doesn't mean that we don't then use that to be inspired towards like a deeper vigilance and a deeper caring and a deeper sense of protection, right? And understand that we can get better at it. We do get better at it, and how powerful that is in terms of our meditation practice. So much of our encouragement in terms of our practice is going to be on the realms of like, well, exploring it. Something difficult comes up, explore it. What are the physical sensations? What are the thoughts? What's the energy behind it? That builds a very powerful, that aspect of mindfulness builds a lot of strength of heart. But to not deny that there are times where it's like, oh, we need to be very careful about how far we go in a certain direction. That we notice something that's very compelling to us, we see it, and we just note it from a sort of an open view, right? We're not looking at all of the details, or that we are at least trained ourselves in the details of how to relate to any detail in this certain way. There's a famous story of a monk, Mahatissa, who had trained for years and years of his disenchantment with the body, right? And, these are very long, powerful, and difficult practices. The sense of looking at pus and blood and phlegm and, head hairs and body hairs and oils and secretions, like these practices that people still do for long periods of time. These are not the method that we start people on or train them in sort of these days or in this context, but they're very legitimate practices. And it said that, so years into his monastic life and years into training this in the forest, but not enlightened, but training. He was in the forest, and a beautiful woman smiled at him, and he realized, like, it was very quick, where it was like it was not a threat. There didn't need to be a sense of feeling like this was a threat anymore, because he was so guarded that when she smiled, he just looked at her teeth, and he had been practicing so long on disenchantment with the teeth that he became instantly enlightened, right? That it was like, sometimes sometimes we need an external thing, right? Or we can't just be the sort of same thing, like a new kind of experience pops up, and yet our training matches it, and this sort of like glimmer of this person's teeth like shattered the whole world of delusion that he had still been creating around himself, right? Because of this training. So again, it's like this guardedness, this protectiveness. It starts to feel like the stronger it is, the less threatening the world around us is, right? The less defended we actually need to be in the heart, right? That actually the heart can't be hardened. Ultimately, the heart needs to be softened, needs to have tenderness, needs to have kindness, needs to have compassion, needs to be able to connect in order to be liberated, right? So the guardedness and the sense restraint, there might be times where it is more forceful, right? When we meditate, we close our eyes, and there is a way that we're shutting off that aspect of the world. Maybe we're averting consciousness a little bit from sound and from other experiences if we're really focusing on the breath, or vice versa. So it isn't to say that we don't manage this at times, absolutely, but to understand also, of course, that ultimately the liberated mind doesn't need protection from experiences, right? That each sense door is so safe and secure in its clarity, and the mindfulness at each sense door is so intact and so secure and so powerful that there is no threat. And not only is there no threat, but that everything is a reminder of our ability to be awakened, right? A reminder of the truth, and is an inspiration toward that. There's a in the Kimsuka Sutta, there's a story at the end of it that I'll read to you. The Buddha is talking to a group of nuns and monks. Suppose that there were a royal frontier fortress with strong walls and ramparts and 6 gates. In it would be a wise, experienced, intelligent gatekeeper to those they didn't know, and to let those in that they did. A swift pair of messengers coming from the east would say to the gatekeeper, "Where, my good friend, is the commander of this fortress?" And they would say, "Oh, there they are, friend, sitting in the central square." And the swift pair of messengers, delivering their accurate report to the commander of the fortress, would then go back by the route by which they had come. And then a swift pair of messengers coming from the west, coming from the north, coming from the south, would say to the gatekeeper, "Where, my good friend, is the commander of this fortress?" And they would say, "There they are, friends, sitting in the central square." The swift pair of messengers would go on, delivering their accurate report to the commander of the fortress, and would then go back by the route by which they had come. And so the Buddha explains, "I've given you this simile to convey a message. The message is this. The fortress stands for the body, composed of the 4 elements, born of a mother and father, nourished with rice and barley gruel, subject to constant rubbing and abrasion, to breaking and falling apart. The 6 gates stand for the 6 internal sense media. The gatekeeper stands for mindfulness. The swift pair of messengers stands for tranquility and insight. The commander of the fortress is consciousness. The central square stands for the 4 great elements of earth, water, fire, and air. And the accurate report stands for unbinding, nibbana. The route by which they had come stands for the Noble Eightfold Path, right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration." And so sometimes these metaphors feel sort of like archaic and like feudal in ways that are hard to relate to. But the value of it, of really understanding that it's not just by chance. There's millions of other metaphors the Buddha could have used and did use around the practice, but that there's a reason to think of this as a fortress, right? And to think of mindfulness as the gatekeeper. And that these swift pair of messengers of tranquility and of insight, coming back and forth, right, with mindfulness as the gatekeeper, that's the only thing, right, that is allowed in and out, is a tranquility and insight, understanding, right? This coming together of concentration and mindfulness in powerful ways. So that what is the message that we receive with mindfulness and concentration, tranquility and insight coming through, each of the six sense media, guarded, by mindfulness. And what is the message? The message is unbinding. How beautiful a choice. It's not to say the message is dukkha. The message from the world out there is like, impermanence and suffering and hardship. And like, yes, we know that message. That is a message for sure, right? But this idea that like, that all of the sense stimuli, that the message is unbinding, is liberation, is peace, right? Disenchantment, non-attachment, non-self, right? The unbinding that comes through insight and tranquility. And how beautiful, how nourishing, how free and spacious the liberation, right, that comes from this fortress of our practice, this fortress of seclusion, right, and of sense restraint, and how fundamentally important that is for our practice, for protecting our goodness, and for realizing the promise of the practice. I think there's just one other thing I want to say about and it might not be very totally clear, but it feels important to say in terms of this existential seclusion and protection of ourselves, inspired by this person. I think that even with mindfulness and even with practice, that we have to be very careful about what's shared. And I've read a thing recently about I won't go into it in detail. Someone sort of referring to a lot of it, talking about his community. A lot of those of us in this sort of secular mindfulness world have begun to realize that mindfulness doesn't solve everything. That you need to also have X, Y, and Z things. And there's that's a very good understanding, because mindfulness is not designed to solve everything. Mindfulness is not designed to solve anything, actually, in terms of samsara. That is not what it's useful for. There are things that it can be integrated with that are useful, but I think that it's like for to realize that there's part of our practice. We can defend our practice in terms of the cultivation of wholesome states and wholesome qualities and the beauty that creates in the world. Absolutely, right? That's not difficult to do. That the wisdom that we generate helps us be more careful in terms of our actions, in terms of our conduct, that the morality and the purification of action and moral conduct is a baseline for realization, and all of these things have social value. That's totally true and worth honoring and acknowledging. But I think there's something about this man's life and death and the way that he chose and the integrity of his silence that just makes me want to remind us and myself that in the end, Nibbana doesn't need justification from samsara. And samsara is never going to justify nibbana. It's never going to justify the world, the cycles, the endless, what we're all doing and what we're all involved in and what we're all subject to in this world and through greed, hatred, and delusion is never going to value the escape from that, the liberation from that. It will value certain things about mindfulness that reaffirm its own belief system. It will value certain things around concentration and ethics, morality it'll fold back into its mechanisms, right, of subjugation. But that ultimately, like the deepest freedom, the deepest release, the deepest liberation is totally outside of that. It doesn't need the validation of the world or of society or of your friends or of your family, right? That like your liberation, your realization of deepest peace, your unbinding doesn't need a justification that anyone else will understand. And that we have to hold on to that at some fundamental level to protect our practice in the midst of all that we encounter. So that is our offering for today, and we do have time for some questions about your practice, about the instructions, about the talk that might be supportive. And just remember, if you can raise your little Zoom hand if you have a question, we'll be happy to take it. Hi, Rick. You should be able to. There you go.
Yeah, so as I think of this idea of a fortress and the protection through mindfulness, I get this image of a battle going on. And I don't know that the Buddha would have called it a battle. Is there some kind of a way that you look at this as being more of a peaceful way that this is all acting out in terms of a metaphor?
Michelle, do you want to, or I can start, or you want to start?
I've actually thought about that a lot. And I feel like there's a lot of different kinds of imagery in the way that the Buddha taught. But when he did use battle imagery, I think that he was acknowledging that unless there's a balance of mindfulness and concentration at each moment, that there is a battle. So that if there's peace, if there's actually moments where connected and not, there's equanimity, there's if there's unconditional acceptance of what's happening, there's peace. But if there isn't, there is a war. And I think it's actually more helpful to understand that about ourselves, that the reason we yearn for peace and yearn for the times to do the practice are because we're not peaceful. Yeah. So I think how I would say it is that we're at war until we're at peace. And so usually the more we taste peace, usually there's more willingness to face the war, to be honest about it, and not take it personally, so that there isn't an attachment to the idea of peace versus understanding that particularly when the 7 factors of awakening, when they're in balance, that they converge into a moment of peace, of real peace and liberation. I think that when we get that, I think it's perhaps much more understandable why the Buddha did use that imagery. And lastly, of course, I have thought about this a lot. There's the there's a way that you can see the 5 hindrances and the factors of awakening as a battle between war and peace, for example. I'm not sure how to articulate this well, but I think that there's a way in which it's that wanting to be, wanting the human being, wanting the human world, like right now, wanting it to be more peaceful than it actually is actually not understanding what's going on in people's minds that are actually producing it. Like, it's like greed, hatred, and delusion. It's like, if we're able to actually face that, that's what creates the wars being identified in one moment. It's only being identified in one moment with greed or hatred, delusion, that it's those forces that that if we can't look at the planet and go, whoa, this is happening because of that, right? If we can't get that, there's no way to work with it. And so I think your question is like really important. And I know in my early years of formal Buddhist practice, I kept retranslating everything out of war imagery because I kept saying, oh, the translator made another mistake. He meant to say gentle, 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 because inwardly there was so much aversion, that there was so much war going on inside me that I couldn't handle hearing it. Like, it was just like so overwhelming. And of course, obviously the 3 of us aren't teaching with that intensity of battle imagery for a reason, because I think that culturally, we need to hear about loving kindness and compassion, and that we need to hear how to have an attention that is kind and caring and gentle. But I think it's also really important to be able to acknowledge why the human world looks the way it does. So I think it's a great question. Thank you.
As you spoke, Michele, thank you so much for that explanation. That it came to me like, if we use peace as the centerpiece, and then everything else is non-peace, maybe that's one way to do it. And instead of some of it's the imagery we get of battle war. If we use a different talk of unevenness, disruption, and things like that, it might be a way that it takes it out of a war setting into more of, you know, of another way of looking at it. It's
Right.
reframing. Let's put it
Right.
that way. I don't know. No, thank you for that, because it really
Yeah.
that brought
Well,
that to my mind. So
I
appreciate
grew up with my dad was a fighter, famous flying ace fighter pilot, and he was, my training was very warrior-like, but there was such an unhealthy unhealthy warrior aspect to it because it wasn't balanced with gentleness and kindness and care. And I think ultimately that's what we're all dealing with. It's a lot to heal. There's a lot to heal culturally, and then there's liberation, and we're all in that soup. Jesse, I talked a bit long about that, but it's a topic dear to my heart. Jesse, you disappeared.
Well,
Oh,
I didn't
there
mean
you
to disappear.
Yeah.
I'm withdrawing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, yeah, everything, you both said. It's it is important to recognize, I think, that the Buddha used a lot of war imagery. So that might not be what is like tended to be doled out in sort of like Western Dharma settings, but it's very much a part of the tradition. And I think that Michelle, the two things, like the kind of aspects of it that I would say are like to it's important to recognize that there are times where it does feel like a war, right? Where you're meditating and you might think you're trying to do peace, but it's awful, right? And you're in excruciating pain and your mind is crazy and the sense of like maybe there's a value in acknowledging the experience of it at times feeling like you're embattled with very forces that you're overwhelmed by, and that to deny that is not actually maybe helpful. I think that there's an acknowledgement of the heroic forces needed to show up against some of what we encounter, and so that's a very common way, especially in like patriarchies, to honor the heroism, right, is through the language of warriorship um, and so while I think this sense of like it's obviously out of balance in our society, I think it was out of balance in the Buddhist society. It also doesn't mean that it's totally wrong either, right? That there is a place for that, and of course we have people in our world in our lives that are examples of a kind of spiritual warriorship that's like really beautiful and valued, and and where it's the sense of the vigor and the vitality and the intensity is matched with the tools, and the weapons are always going to be love and wisdom. And so that is I think that what is hard for us in general is the paradox of that, of like, can we be animated and inspired by the truthfulness of the experience that it feels like that at times, the validity of the energizing kind of qualities of that, um, but at the same time always have the mechanisms of liberation actually be peaceful and caring and tender. And that can feel like a very incongruous thing, in the mind and in the heart. But that I would say it's more important to engage the paradox than to just deny it either. One of the last thing you said reminded me of, there was a time where a student, one of the typical language you often hear in the tradition is like sensory impingement, right? That at every moment the sense doors are being impinged upon by contact, right? Sense contact. And I remember we were at a retreat once, and a yogi asked, like, well, doesn't that feel kind of violent? And can't we just say that it's like we're caressed by sense experience, And it's like, you could say that, but that actually isn't what the experience is, right? And we have to get to the place of really feeling like we feel like we're being attacked. That is a legitimate insight experience of overwhelm, of feeling like this is oppressive, right? That existence is oppressive needs to be something we feel, and that it's not just caressing, that it isn't just beautiful, is actually part of the insight practice. So I think it's a very important question, to my view. In fact, I wrote a whole book about it, and I'll put the link on it here. You can, anyone who hasn't heard about it already, you can look at there. It may not be anyone's cup of tea. It isn't really anyone's cup of tea, but you're welcome to check it out because it is an engagement around this issue of like how do we um, uh, deal with the intensity of some of this imagery and of the lineage and of those forces internally, and honor, I think, this, what Michelle is saying, the method that we have around tenderness and loving kindness and compassion and wisdom as the fundamental driving forces. So yeah, thanks, Rick. Kathy.
Hi.
Okay.
Hi. I so for the last couple of years, I've been thinking about doing a longer retreat. And this year, it's finally gonna happen. So I signed up and I got accepted into the Insight Meditation Society, their 3-month retreat. So I'll be leaving in a week. And I feel really excited and also slightly terrified. So yeah, any comments, thoughts, anything?
Yay.
Good luck.
Yeah. Good luck.
Just kidding.
When people aren't terrified to go on a long retreat, I'm like very suspicious. I think something's missing. Something is not right if you're not like really scared in a good way. and that doesn't mean that you actually have anything to be scared of, or that that it won't be just sort of like a 9-day retreat, but just much longer. It isn't that. It's more like that feels very wholesome to me, and very healthy, of this sense of, we just recognize that we have a lot of work to do, and that there are aspects of our being that we just have not had the time or space or skill to engage and to understand, and that you are going into an experience, and this is true for a short retreat, right? Or even any sitting. This sense of like you're recognizing that you're willing to go into unknown territory, and that it's not going to be predictable, and you won't be able to control it. It's understandable, of course, that it's scary, and I think that there's it's a really, that is maybe the most important heroism, right? I think that is worth, like, that actually should be honored and kind of maybe highlighted more in our tradition, is that sense of the willingness to do it anyway, right? The willingness to know that it's important, and that we're dedicated to understanding, ourselves and the mind, the body, the heart, and that we're willing to go into unknown territory, and into territory where we have not yet trained, where we're going to be beyond the limits of our training, and to know that that's part of the training and how we get stronger and better and more versatile. So I'm just so happy for you. I know it's been a super long time coming, and for we who know your practice, it's like we have total confidence in you and your ability to do it, and not just ability to do it, but that your impending thrivingness in it feels very obvious to me. So I'm really happy to hear
it. I also would just feel very happy for you. Really, so much mudita, and pre-computers, which goes back quite a ways, but in the old days when Steve and I were teaching 3-month retreats there, the way that retreats were advertised everywhere was by paper. So people would have to, like with the Honolulu Sangha, we'd have to put brochures advertising the retreat out in, health food stores or, whatever. It's like the world has changed dramatically, but a lot of work went into designing the brochures and, getting them printed and having them put out all over the place. And I remember working on the blurb for the 3-month retreat. And I think pretty much in the first sentence, it was mentioned that it was an intensive. And I think that it really shouldn't leave that out anywhere, even with a 10-day retreat, or like a day long, but like that. I think that we often as humans, because we're excited about doing it, or we're afraid, we miss that particular word, which I think is so important. Because why it's it can feel formidable is that we know it's going to be intense, but we tend to kind of forget it. So that you can imagine in a 3-month retreat that boredom just gets very intense, right? That's the only thing about it that's different, is that boredom gets intense, or fear gets intense, or happiness gets intense. But that willingness to go through pretty much every human experience, sleeping or sleepiness, or we're just going through it more and more awake. So that's just remember that. I think you should write it down somewhere, is that it's only because it will feel intense that it will feel at times difficult. It's and I'll usually, when we used to teach them, I'd come in the retreat about a month in and say, don't forget, don't forget, like it's getting difficult sometimes because it's getting, intense, right? That's all it is, right? And so the pandemic has caused a certain amount of intensity in our lives without being on retreat per se, but there's a kind of level of seclusion. I'm almost 3 weeks at COVID now, quarantined, and there's a certain intensity to it that I think reminds me a lot of a long retreat that is very important to acknowledge. That to me, it's the best thing you can do with your life. So I think it's a noble thing to do. It's the best thing to do, and just put that somewhere on a piece of paper. The only issue about this right now is that it's feeling maybe too intense. And then just take a break. The best advice I was given by my first teacher was, the mind will not deepen unless it's relaxed. And if you go into a 3-month retreat and you're just going to step on the gas and just try to go too fast, too hard, it's going to backfire. But if you take 2 weeks to ease into it, don't listen to what anybody's saying. Take my advice. Really, I really feel like it's the best advice I ever got by any teacher. He said, your mind is going to deepen if it's relaxed, and do not fall for working too hard right away. Just ease in, and it works. Ease in, and it'll work. So that's my 2 cents. Yeah.
And actually, I want to say, this is like makes me so happy. I almost can't even handle it. Iswar is also going on the 3-month retreat.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you all have met in person or not, but you've both been on Zooms a bunch together, and you're both wonderful. And who know? I don't know if there are others also who will be there this fall. But I'm so happy that you both will be there and together. And that's sometimes good too, to have a little anchor.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to know, or even like know of, not that, yeah, I don't think we've met in person before, but I'm looking forward to meeting you.
Have a great retreat.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
both of you.
Well, shall we call it a day? Hmm. Wonderful to be with you all. For all of us who can't go on the 3-month retreat, of course, you can join us for our 9-day retreat online in September. And of course, as usual, there's like you could join for the weekend or you can do part-time the whole time, whatever works. So we look forward, of course, to that beginning in a few weeks, but we still have a little time before that.
It's great to get to sit together. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Take good care of yourselves and each other. We'll see you next week.